Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our webinar, Don't Get Schooled, Performance and Security Tips from a Leading SaaS Education Company. My name is Christian Paulus. I'm your host today. I'm running product marketing here at Cloudflare. And I'm very excited to have with me today David Kanczewski, who is the Director of Technical Infrastructure at Schooloop. Hello, David.
Hello, Christian. Good morning.
Perfect. So let me quickly go through the agenda. So I will kick off this webinar with a quick description of some of the challenges SaaS companies specifically see. And then the majority of this time we will really spend on a really interesting case study on Schooloop. And the last 50 minutes, like always, we reserved for questions and answers. And for all of you, please add your questions during the sessions into the question box if you have any. And we will also be sending out the recording of this and the slides after the session. So here's an overview of what our customers tell us their biggest web performance and security challenges are. And on the security side, we see that websites, applications, or APIs might become unavailable because of distributed denial of services attacks. Another security vector might be breaches of system to compromise sensitive customer data. And lastly, but increasingly, abusive bot activity. On the performance side, there is mainly really one big problem, and it's just application is too slow. You can break down this problem into related challenges, which then can be addressed one after the other. So the first one would be the application needs to be fast wherever the consumer really is. The second one would be the web property needs to provide a rich user experience to optimize engagement and conversion. And this should be on any type of screen, including mobile. And then lastly, website needs to be fast and available at any time. And in some cases, seasonal or spiky traffic is the most important traffic to a business. So when David will walk us through the Schooloop case study, he will actually touch on each of those problems. However, the focus of this webinar will be on a type of data breach which is specific to SaaS companies. And the Cloudflare solution to address this challenge is called SSL for SaaS. So let me dive into this a little bit more in detail. So SaaS companies want to encrypt the communication between the SaaS application and the customer to prevent snooping. Snooping is a data breach attack vector where a customer thinks that he communicates with a specific application, but in reality, he communicates with a man in the middle. The man in the middle listens to all traffic coming from the consumer and then forwards the traffic to the original destination. SaaS companies typically find themselves in one of three situations which we have depicted here. The first one is unencrypted but branded vanity domains. A branded site provides ease of use to the end customer of the SaaS company, but without encryption, content can be vulnerable to being modified en route. In the past, both AT&T and Comcast have been caught injecting ads, and additionally, in the current political climate, it appears that ISPs may soon become liable or be able to sell private browsing data. The second scenario would be encrypted but unbranded domains. Subdomains offered to end customers by SaaS providers are used as the customer's asset URL. For an example, endcustomer.saasprovider.com. The subdomain now lacks proper branding and results in a lower level of visitor trust, and it degrades SEO ranking. However, communication now can be encrypted using TLS to protect against snooping. And the third scenario would be the challenging in-house custom approach. Up until this point, SaaS providers who require branded vanity domains with encryption had to go and build a custom solution. So let's dive into this option a little bit more into detail. So if a SaaS company wants to provide branded and encrypted sites, there are really two options. The first one is manually manage the SSL lifecycle for end customers, resulting in long deployment types and overhead costs. Or secondly, build a complex automated in-house solution. Both of these scenarios technically solve the problem at hand, but it places a burden on both the SaaS provider and the end customer. If you go down the manual path, you will end up manually managing the life cycle of certificates. This includes domain validation, certificate issuance, renewal, and reissuance. As the number of end customer websites grows, the manual effort increases, and a new team within your company will be required to handle the workload. Additional challenges start to occur. Customers will be required to renew their certificates before expiration takes place, or their assets will go offline. The other road is to build a solution to automate this process. This can be done through an integration with technologies like Let's Encrypt, but this integration quickly becomes clunky. It requires to securely handle encryption keys, globally distribute them, and maintain those keys through the life cycle. And that's really a very difficult task. There's a much easier way to address those challenges, and it is an out-of-the-box solution provided by Cloudflare called SSL for SaaS. So there are 4 aspects here. The first one is it provides a branded visitor experience. SSL for SaaS allows customers to CNAME their custom vanity URLs to ensure branded visitor experience and greater SEO. Secondly, it provides secure and fast-performing websites. Cloudflare allows the seamless ability to add dedicated SSL or TLS certificates to a CNAMEd custom vanity URL. Data transferred over HTTPS is encrypted to ensure secure transport of data. And an additional benefit is that the modern HTTP2 protocol can be used for further speed improvements. Third, automated lifecycle management. Cloudflare manages the entire SSL lifecycle for end customers of a SaaS provider. The burden of handling the SSL lifecycle is removed for both the SaaS provider and the end customer. And lastly, rapid SSL deployment. During the SSL issuance process, Cloudflare transmits new certificate requests, propagates them to the edge, and brings HTTPS online in actually less than 5 minutes. So David, you have been using SSL for SaaS at SchoolLoop. What about walking us through your case study?
Sure, thanks, Christian. Well, SchoolLoop is basically a communication portal for K-12 schools across the country. We represent teachers and faculty as well as the students and the parents within the community. And in all, we represent over 400 schools and nearly 4 million individual users. Each of those users gets an individual login. So this is something of a summary of what we do. We basically support web portals and gradebooks, closed loop email, discussion groups, much more. And as this illustrates, there are a number of threads throughout the application. But if we just consider the life cycle of perhaps an assignment, it touches many of our pain points. It starts here with the teacher creating the assignment, posting it to the web portal, The student sees that on his portal, and then has the opportunity to turn work in online. The teacher then grades the work, publishes the progress report, and the student and parents can see the grades on their portal. This all drives the various business requirements of our system, and paramount among them is performance. The system has to be able to handle the traffic and the load generated by our users. They generally don't all make demands on us at the same time, but there are some exceptions. Notably, the beginning of the school year, teachers set up their portals, their project pages, and so forth, all during the first couple of weeks of the school year. This is also the same time that parents and students are getting their first access to the system. They're logging in and exploring. And all of this leads to an increase in traffic. Further throughout the year, schools impose specific deadlines for teachers to enter grades so they can issue the progress reports that can be sent home to the families. And oftentimes these deadlines correspond across districts, not intentionally, of course, but they do. And examples of that are also at the end of the semesters, just before winter break, and come the end of the school year in June. We end up seeing a lot of increased traffic. We also see an increase in traffic, a spike when homework deadlines match up. Students are notorious for waiting till the last minute to do their homework, and that leads to many of the assignments being submitted just before the deadline. If we have a network outage at this time, the old dog ate my homework excuse becomes the 21st century version, school loop ate my homework. And we certainly don't want to be the source of their excuse. We also have legal and contractual obligations to maintain the sanctity of the data inside our system, be it from attackers against our software or from interception in transit. We're not only publishing just the students' grades, but our system's used between counselors and therapists, and their traffic might contain messages about health or medical conditions or even psychiatric issues that are of quite a sensitive nature. We may not be housing Social Security or credit card numbers that have been the subject of the most recent breaches out there, but we still have to consider the ethical implications of the data that we're hosting being breached. And finally, many of our schools want to use the domain name that they and their communities have come to know. We certainly provide them a school loop domain, but it's not fair to ask them to use that when they've been using their own domain for years. So business requirements inevitably drive technical requirements, and obviously from the performance requirement comes the need for responsive and available systems, prevention against DDoS attacks, and the ability to handle these seasonal spikes. Security drives us to various services that protect our traffic from interception. And of course, there's branding that drives the need for custom domains or vanity domains. Before I move on, though, I'd like to make a quick digression on performance. The gradebook that I mentioned on the previous slide is our single most sensitive part of the application. We generate network traffic every time that the teacher tabs through one of the input cells, input fields on their input form. And we have to receive that traffic, record it, and move the cursor onto the next field before or else the whole process gets bogged down. This is obviously so they can recover from browser failures and pick up exactly where they left off. But it becomes a performance bottleneck if there's a lot of that traffic coming in at the same time. And most importantly, the teachers are very close to the decision makers. So the technical requirement feeds right back into the business requirement. If decision makers receive enough performance complaints from their teachers, we might not see renewals come next semester, next year. Before we had Cloudflare, we did support custom domains or vanity domains, but we did it in a very limited support. If a district pointed their DNS to our proxy IPs, we could then, we had a mapping of their domain name into our school loop school data, and we could respond to their domain with the school portal. But we could only do it for unsecured traffic. We're only able to publish public data this way, things like their school calendar and bell schedules, contact information, or department portals. But anytime a user logged in, we would force them to we'd send a redirect to their corresponding schoolloop.com domain. That would happen anytime a student wanted to check her homework, or a parent wanted to log in and check his child's grades, and of course when a teacher would log in to update the grades. The school loop domain we could protect with our wildcard SSL certificate, and so the traffic was protected from the man-in-the-middle snooping that Christian was talking about earlier. And it was fairly seamless, except if the user went to bookmark the page or happened to look up at the URL bar during the process, they could notice the change and would it became less convenient and a little bit awkward for the schools. We're also finding ourselves under frequent denial of service DDoS attacks. This graphic shows our inbound traffic to our network in blue, and we see it capping out our network link and stealing bandwidth from our valid traffic. This means, of course, that no teacher could publish grades, no student could check on that assignment, nobody could even pull up the school loop calendar or the school calendar to see when the next band performance might be scheduled. Something had to be done. And so we realized we needed something to protect us against these continued DDoS attacks, and it led us to evaluate several vendors that provided this kind of service. First off, we needed good bang for our bucks. The vendor had to prevent the attacks from reaching our network and our servers, and do so for a reasonable amount of money. Some wanted to take all of our traffic and route just the clean traffic to us. But that, while it's a wonderful idea, that kind of offering was outside of our price range. And when I say all of our traffic, they'd handle SMTP as well as HTTP. So they'd handle email and DNS requests and like our incoming time, NTP, basically everything. But by intercepting and filtering just our web traffic and putting us onto a private, separate address space, not private, but separate address space, Cloudflare provided exactly the service we needed, and they even had a free plan. We realized that certainly wasn't going to meet our needs, but they did offer very competitive enterprise pricing. We also needed something that was always on and easy to implement. Some vendors required that we throw a switch when we detected an attack to protect our traffic, and that didn't really solve our problem. We still had to have human intervention. Others wanted us to implement the BGP routing and send all our traffic to them, as I mentioned in the last bullet. But Cloudflare's DNS-based solution provided the all the time configuration with a very easy setup. And of course, we wanted a vendor that was going to be around. Cloudflare had, at the time, been around for several years and was getting a lot of press about the quality of their service. So we made the decision and got on board with Cloudflare in the summer of 2013, and we're up and running by the beginning of our 2013-14 school year. Our initial reasons for going with Cloudflare were entirely driven by the need for the DDoS protection, but we have subsequently expanded our use to include many of their systems. We'll talk about most of these in the subsequent slides, but I want to mention Managed CNAME first, which, yeah, down at the bottom there. Customers who had their own, I'm sorry, when we first implemented Cloudflare, we were only set up to protect our schoolloop.com domains. Customers that had their own domains still had to route through what we called our dirty proxies, and those were susceptible to attack by DDoS. They were public addresses that could be seen. It would be handed to you through DNS, and we would see DOS attacks being launched. This was fine if a customer was already logged in. They'd already be redirected to a school loop domain, and their traffic would be filtered through Cloudflare and bypass the denial of service attack. But if they hadn't yet logged in and needed to go through their school's custom domain, their vanity domain, that traffic would still be routed to School Loop, but over our dirty network and subject to the attack. And then in this case, they had no way to log in the first place to get to the protected page. Managed CNAME was the savior. It allowed our customers to set up a CNAME record pointing their custom domain into our Cloudflare protected domain, and Cloudflare would pick up that request, any traffic coming in through that over that CNAME, and route it to our clean proxies, whose IP addresses hadn't been published, and so none of the traffic touched the dirty proxies, and all of our production entry points were thus protected against the DDoS. SSL for SaaS is the mechanism by which we could protect the managed CNAME domains, meaning the custom domains on the previous slide, against snooping. When we first implemented SSL for SaaS, Cloudflare didn't have a user interface for setting it up. They do have that today, but even if you have more than just a handful of custom domains, you're going to want to use some kind of an API or some kind of script to call their API. We currently support over 2,200 custom domains, so I wrote a script. It's pretty straightforward. It starts by querying my database, pulling up all of my custom domains, and then I walk that list. And for each one, I first query the customer's DNS to make sure they have the CNAME set up properly. If it isn't set up properly, it does nobody any good to ask Cloudflare to try to secure a domain whose traffic doesn't even point to them. But if the DNS is good, I then check to see with Cloudflare if I've already set up the domain. This lets my system remain stateless. Cloudflare owns the success or failure of the setup, and if it's not set up, then I issue the API call and simply add the certificate, the API call that asks Cloudflare to set up the certificate and enable SSL for SaaS, and then move on to the next record. Christian mentioned that it takes less than 5 minutes to set up the certificate. I haven't actually timed it, but I can say that if I run this script twice back to back, every request that I submitted in the first run will be active during the second. So it certainly happens quickly. In addition to SSL for SaaS, I mentioned that we're using the WAF rules. We start by turning them all on, and then turns out that there are a few that break our services. Case in point is that our content management system allows certain users to enter raw HTML into their pages, into the web pages that they're publishing. And this sometimes triggers a cross-site posting rule in the WAF, or cross-site scripting. Our CMS checks the nature of the HTML to begin with, so we knew we weren't in any danger for this. So we were able to safely disable that particular rule. I'll be the first to admit that it is not easy to find a particular WAF rule amongst the hundreds that are implemented. They're laid out somewhat hierarchically, but it's still very difficult to drill into the exact rule. And for this, I have to make a shout out of kudos to the Cloudflare Enterprise Support team. They've been very responsive and very helpful at demystifying the WAF rules and helping us get to the bottom of it, among other things. Okay, moving on. Firewall rules. Our schools are entirely within the United States, so I've been able to set up firewall rules such that any traffic from a non-US based IP address is presented with a CAPTCHA before being allowed to progress and get into the system. Since much of the DOS traffic originates internationally, this cuts down quite significantly on the amount of traffic that even gets to the Cloudflare servers. And in the case where Timmy's dad happens to be on a business trip in Europe and wants to check back and see what how Timmy's grades are, he can simply enter the CAPTCHA and still proceed into the system and do so. Argo was just plain simple. We turned it on and it started routing. It basically chooses Cloudflare's network or the public internet, depending on which is more responsive at the time. And when it's routing over, even when it's routing over Cloudflare, it keeps checking the internet a certain percentage of the with a certain percentage of the requests in case things change, and dynamically switches to whichever route is the most efficient. So if you come back after 24 hours after turning it on, you can look at the analytics and just see how much of an improvement you've gotten. So how has Cloudflare helped? Life after Cloudflare. Before we implemented, we were seeing something on the order of 20 or more DOS attacks per school year, over the course of the school year. It's trivially easy today for students and even the not-so-savvy ones to launch a denial of service attack. They don't even need to own a credit card. They can simply go down to the 7-Eleven, plunk down $30, get a single-use card, come home and plug that into the botnet portal, and presto, school loop is DOSed. That happened because we published our IP addresses before Cloudflare and through using round-robin DNS. And so they knew where they could plug in to attack. I certainly knew how to mitigate it. I'd simply call my upstream network provider and have them black hole the address under attack. And then, of course, I'd have to pull that address out of my DNS so that valid traffic no longer went to it. It works, but that's a manual process, and it takes time. And I have to go back later and check with my uplink to see if we're still under attack at that address and put the address back into production. And sometimes I'm not in a place to do so immediately. And so that left our uptime in the range of 3 nines that year, which is certainly not good, and started leading to some performance complaints, numerous performance complaints. But after implementing Cloudflare and going through getting it set up, this past school year we saw exactly 0 successful DOS attacks make it into our network. Our uptime is now approaching 5 nines, which is much happier. My management's happier. My schools are happier. Everybody's happy. And even the few points that I'm missing from 5 nines aren't, I can't blame Cloudflare. Those are self-inflicted issues. So this demonstrates how SSL for SaaS has improved our situation from the user point of view. They no longer have to use the clunky schoolloop.com domain in the first slide. They get the same content by going to their HUSD domain in this case, and you can see that it is indeed HTTPS protected. Argo, as I mentioned, you simply turn it on and it starts working. This is an example of the analytics page, and it shows over the past 48 hours here, 27% of our traffic has been routed over Cloudflare's network, and that accounts for 41% improvement in the performance, bringing the average round trip time down from 193 milliseconds to 113 milliseconds. So it's very simple. It just works. They just route it over which, it's automatic. It gets routed over whichever path is the most efficient at the time. I mentioned ease of deployment in an earlier slide. Doing the initial setup for the DDoS protection was really as simple as uploading our DNS entries into Cloudflare's network and orange clouding the ones they wanted protected, the ones that we wanted protected. Orange clouding basically means that Cloudflare will proxy all that traffic and pass it through their firewall, WAF rules, page rules, and DOS protection. They even have a tool to upload a standard bind zone file directly into their system. So, of course, I took advantage of mucking around with our DNS and cleaned up a bunch of the old static stale entries. And then I just used the bind tool to push the information up into Cloudflare. Did some DNS queries to make sure we're happy and everything was working. And then I logged into my domain registrar and pointed the name server records at Cloudflare. And as soon as my registrar updated that data with the top level domain servers, our traffic was routing through Cloudflare and we were being protected. I will admit their user interface in the early days, for lack of a better term, sucked. It was really the initial reason I wrote my DNS API script. They've since replaced that interface with one that sucks less, but even if you're managing more than just a handful of records, you probably want to use a tool anyway. I also wrote a reverse tool to pull the Cloudflare records, the DNS records out of Cloudflare and insert them into TinyDNS, the server that I use internally for my Split Horizon DNS. That way I don't have to maintain the data in 2 places. I maintain it in Cloudflare and it gets pulled appropriately into my local name server. The SSL for SaaS script probably took a total of about 5 hours to develop. It took a couple of hours to go through the documentation for the API and change my DNS script to use the SSL API and then parse the results. And then perhaps another 3 or so hours to write the wrapper that queries my database and pulls the DNS and makes the Cloudflare API call. It was really a very straightforward process. I now run it daily, and all of our custom domains are automatically protected with SSL within a day of their being turned up on our network. So this slide's a little bit embarrassing. These are actual quotes that Christian captured as we were working on the presentation. The first really takes the DDoS protection to heart, though. There's no reason anymore for me to have to call my upstream provider and black hole anything. Cloudflare just prevents all of that. And as for SSL with SaaS, our schools no longer have to advertise the clunky schoolloop.com domains. They can send the kids home with a note telling them to log into their domain that their community knows and loves well. Maybe the kids don't love it, but the parents certainly do. And I've said it over and over again about Argo. It just works. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions.
David, thank you very much. This is a great presentation. I think that's a difficult problem many SaaS companies are facing, and so I think that's great to see how you successfully implemented this solution. So again, if you have a question, please enter them into the questions box in the interface you're using. And I see a few questions already in here. So the first one I see, how long does it take to onboard a new customer, to onboard a new end customer? And so essentially I think it's a two-step process. The first one is to set up the system, to make the calls to the Cloudflare APIs. And you heard from David, it's really a small effort, and it takes a few hours, perhaps half a day, or something like this. But then once you have the system set up, the actual process to issue a certificate for a new end customer typically takes something less than 5 minutes. And I think that's really an important aspect. I mean, David, I think you also mentioned this before to me, that there are a lot of benefits. You mentioned that you can actually provide the right URL, to let's say schools on the first day of school, isn't it?
Yeah. Once we were in using SSL for SaaS, or even managed CNAME, they can use their own domains now. They don't have to use one of our funky Schoolloop SaaS provider domains.
Yeah, I think it's also very important for some SaaS companies, because now you can embed this entire process into the sign-up process for SaaS for end customers. So I think that's for many customers, that's for many SaaS companies, that's an important aspect as well. So then I see another question here. This is probably, yeah, go on, David.
Oh, I'm sorry. That you're definitely right on track there, because the community, the students and parents don't care that we're using Schoolloop. They just need to get access to their grades. So there's no reason for us for the schools to have to send home a schoolloop.com address. Much better for them to send their own URL. Sorry, that was all I wanted to mention.
Yeah, perfect. There's another question which is very related to this. That's a question for you, David, I think. You say it was easy to retrofit your DNS API to work with SSL for SaaS, but how easy was it to rewrite the initial API? So what was it to write the initial API?
Oh, that wasn't terribly hard at all. It's pretty easy. It's not terribly difficult for anyone with any programming skills. It was a while ago before when I did this, but it seems to me that I was able to read through the documentation and make my first successful API call probably within that same day, and then however long it takes after that to put structure into it and make it do useful was probably a couple, 3 days worth of work. And the good news is that all of Cloudflare's API calls are similar. So that initial development work, that initial investment gets leveraged every other time you need to make some other API call. I now use it for, in addition to DNS, I do page rules, I do some firewall rules, and now obviously SSL for SaaS.
Yeah, perfect. There's another question I see, and again, if you have any questions, please submit them into the questions box, but I see a few more questions coming in. With SSL for SaaS, so if you're using SSL for SaaS, do end customers have to be on a subdomain? And the answer is yes. With SSL for SaaS, the end customer needs to be on a subdomain, and this would look like something like subdomain.endcustomer.com. But then, of course, the domain is branded, and then it would be on a subdomain.
I'll add to that since. Oh, sorry if you have more.
No, go on. Yeah.
It's not technically, the subdomain has to be not a top-level domain. It can't have subcomponents. It has to be something that can be set up with a CNAME record. And if you have a top-level domain, it can't use a CNAME. We've had some schools that wanted to do that, and what we've had to do is have them set up their www flavor of that domain, and then set up a redirect service from if they still are publishing, like in the case of Hayward I mentioned earlier, if they wanted HUSD.net to go to their service, within the DNS system, and this isn't a Cloudflare limitation, it's a limitation of DNS, you're not able to CNAME that top-level domain. And so they can put an A record to go to one of the redirect services that are out there that'll point to www.husd or so.
Yeah, perfect.
And then I explained that well.
Yeah, it's a complicated subject. It's not easy to grasp this. But I see another question, which is probably for you, David. How much traffic does Skulup generate?
More than I ever thought we would. In this past school year, we had 1.5 billion dynamic page views throughout the course of the year. The total hits are much bigger than that because the dynamic page views is just encompasses what we generate through the database. That doesn't include hits back to us for images or slideshows or CSS pages or anything like that. We have two 1 gigabit pipes to support that, and it runs at roughly 700 megabits per second at the 95th percentile traffic, and peaks exceed the full gigabit, 1 gigabit per second.
Yeah, I think that's the question. Probably also aims to kind of see, is this just for smaller companies or for larger companies? And I think the answer, you have a lot of traffic there on your site with Skulup. My kids actually, my school where my kids go to also use Skulup. But I think, this is a very scalable solution, and I think Skulup has kind of 3.8 million consumers. So that's a big user. So that's a big size.
Yeah.
I have another question here. Do you manage the entire certificate lifecycle? And the answer is yes. We manage the lifecycle through domain validation, certificate issuance, and then renewal, and then the reissuance. And so that's really important because, providing the initial certificate, that's not an easy thing, but it's still fairly straightforward. But then maintaining this is actually difficult, and the keys have to be securely stored during this process. As I mentioned before, if you miss a timeline to renew the certificate, then it doesn't work anymore, system goes down, or the key doesn't work anymore. So this becomes actually complicated if you really think through all of these details. It's not an easy thing. And then the related question
that's
here.
That's a big part of why we didn't even want to go through implementing anything until Cloudflare had the solution. We didn't want to take any of roll your own paths. It was just too unwieldy for us to manage.
Yeah, we actually see this quite a lot with customers. So there's Let's Encrypt, to build something on your own. But once we walk customers through this, then there's pretty quickly the realization that this is not a trivial thing to do, and it's a much better way for something like this to just use an out-of-box solution. But a very related question: so do you hold the private key, or does the end customer hold the key? Yeah, so that's an important question, and So Cloudflare holds the private keys for the end customers and the SaaS providers. And of course, we are a security company, so we do this as our business, and we are very much set up to securely hold the private key information. Here's another question, David. If you have a wildcard certificate, can you only specify specific subdomains to Cloudflare and keep some with your SaaS application?
Yes, since the certificate is separate from the DNS, and so you can set up DNS entries to point into the Cloudflare system individually, and so that allows you to pick and choose which domains get protected by Cloudflare, and which domains you can you route elsewhere, and you can have a wildcard DNS entry as well. And since a more specific DNS entry overrides the wildcard, you can do with those specific entries what you wish, and leave the others pointing into the application through the wildcard. That's actually how we've done some schools that we've had to do special handling for instance. Our wildcard within the schoolloop.com domain, our wildcard picks up everything, and then we've set up various domains in addition to the wildcard to route in certain ways. And be aware though that the SSL, the CNAME on the SaaS side of things is still managed by the end user. It's not managed by the SaaS provider. So they have to, if they own the DNS, HUSD.net in the case that I had earlier, they have to set up that CNAME to point into the Cloudflare protected domain. It's a trivial thing to do for DNS manager, and we have some pretty specific instructions for how to do it, since sometimes schools don't have necessarily, not all districts are created equal. Some have less savvy users, and it's usually pretty easy to talk them through going through their DNS provider's user interface to set that up for the ones who don't understand what we're asking them to do. And I hope I answered that question properly.
No, perfect. No, I think this is great. And then I just get a notification here, so we have time for one last question. I see here one. What is the pricing for SSL for SaaS? So that's a service which actually requires customers to be on the Cloudflare Enterprise plan. And so the price is based on the number of the certificates consumed. And so essentially it's based on brackets, and the more certificates you use, then you move up to higher brackets, and then the certificates then get discounted and get cheaper as you consume more. So I think with this, we're out of time. I would like to thank you very much, David. This was a great presentation, very insightful. It's a very complicated subject, but I think it's a great solution we have here. And so I really appreciate all the time and for the great presentation here.
You're absolutely welcome. I'm glad I'm able to contribute.
Yeah, no, I think this was great, and I know that you just have those wildfires also going on in your home, so I especially appreciate the time you're taking here. But with this, I would like to thank everyone for joining the call and for attending. As I mentioned before, we will send out the recording and the slides. And if you have any other questions, please contact us. But thank you very much, and I hope you had a good time. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.